The anarchy, that civil war fought between the usurper King Stephen and his cousin the Empress Matilda for the right to wear the English crown, was a bitter, miserable, and protracted affair that swung one way and then the other. It was a time, it was famously said, that Christ and his angels slept, as England suffered under the weight of all this upheaval. For what it's worth, both Stephen and Matilda would demonstrate courage at different times during the conflict, the sort of courage that was befitting of an English monarch. However, that was of little use when neither side was able to crush the other, and instead allowed the civil war to drag on. Stephen had demonstrated his bravery at the Battle of Lincoln in 1141, where he threw himself into the middle of the fighting and handled himself manfully. It would, however, be to little avail, as Stephen's army was defeated by Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half brother, and worse still, the king was captured and taken prisoner. The throne appeared to be there for the taking for Matilda, but she was driven from London by the capital citizens who despised her and prevented her from being crowned. Matilda was despised by the people of London for her supposed haughtiness and arrogance. A further blow befell Matilda when Robert was captured by forces loyal to Stephen, and a prisoner exchange was arranged. Everything was back to square one. 1141 had been an eventful year in England, and the following years would be little different. William of Newburgh says this of the conflict: perpetual discord still existed between the king and the empress. Sometimes both parties were equal, at another time one had the ascendancy. In truth, the odds were stacked against Matilda, who, as a woman, was trying to establish something that was quite without precedent in England, a female monarch. It was that fact that in all likelihood was keeping Stephen, a useless king, on the throne. For many, a bad king was altogether more preferable to a capable queen, which Matilda, a talented woman with political experience from her time in Germany, surely would have been. I've already mentioned the considerable courage that Stephen had as a soldier, notwithstanding his failings as a king. I now turn my attention to not only Matilda's bravery, but also her cunning in the face of great danger. In 1142, for several months, Matilda found herself besieged by Stephen's forces at Oxford, where, as winter set in, Matilda and her men would have become thoroughly miserable. For Stephen, it was a critical moment, as he had his enemy virtually in his clutches. But Matilda would elude him. Famously, the story goes that Matilda, clad in white, alongside four knights, used the blanket of thick snow that was falling as cover as she slipped out of the castle and made her way across the frozen River Thames to a freedom of sorts. The exact facts of Matilda's escape from Oxford are hard to establish. Could she really have made her way past the army that had her as its number one target? Perhaps her escape was assisted by Stephen's men, also being worn out by the siege and the harsh weather conditions. After all, sieges were difficult for both defenders and attackers, although, admittedly, usually far worse for the former. Whatever the exact escape route was, and the method that Matilda deployed, one fact is certain: that Matilda had slipped out of Stephen's clutches, and would have required a genuine fearlessness, or perhaps a sense of nothing left to lose on Matilda's part, to make her escape, and not to mention a considerable amount of ingenuity as well. And it wasn't the first time that Matilda had been fortunate either during the Civil War, as the Jester Stefani, or the Life of King Stephen, remarks in rather bitter fashion. The author writes: I have never read of another woman so luckily rescued from so many mortal foes, and from the threat of dangers so great. The truth being that she went from the castle of Arundel uninjured through the midst of her enemies. She escaped unscathed from the midst of the Londoners, where they were assailing her, and her only, in mighty wrath, then stole away alone, in wondrous fashion, from the rout of Winchester, when almost all her men were cut off, and then when she left besieged Oxford and came away safe and sound. Naturally, that particular author was heavily biased in favour of Stephen, and it seems very doubtful to me if so many daring escapes made by Matilda could purely be down to luck alone, particularly by a woman in these harsh times. No, I'd place courage and determination as being far more important than any luck Matilda may have benefited from. But, despite her boldness, the harsh reality remained that the civil war with Stephen would remain a stalemate for years to come, although problems would begin to mount up for the king. In 1143, Stephen's forces were routed at Wilton, and, not long after, the Earl of Essex, Geoffrey de Mandeville, rose up in revolt against the king, having been falsely accused of treason and deprived of his castles, which included the Tower of London no less. Worse still, Stephen would lose Normandy in 1144 to Matilda's husband, Geoffrey of Anjou. Although Stephen's reign became steadily more wretched and miserable for the king, Matilda would be unable to take the crown from him, and eventually her son, Henry, would pick up the mantle. For Matilda, as she watched her son, now King Henry II, prove himself quickly to be a very fine ruler, it was some vindication for her long years of toil and trouble. Nonetheless, there would have been a nagging frustration inside her. Her father, Henry I, had designated Matilda as his heir, and the crown was rightfully hers. The fact that she never wore the crown was a price that Matilda had to pay for simply being a woman. All the same, she did press her claims with determination, with Stephen, hard pressed from virtually all sides, barely enjoying a minute's peace throughout his 19-year reign. If she wasn't already, Matilda would have been well aware, after being driven from London, what she was up against. Large parts of the English population were not ready for female rule, and attempts to blame it on Matilda's personality and her supposed haughtiness and arrogance is little more than a diversionary tactic. After the bitter blow of London, Matilda carried on the fight nonetheless, but, being a sharp woman, a moment of realization would soon hit her, and Matilda would instead pass on the responsibility of waging war against Stephen to young Henry. Henry would succeed, but only because of the work that his mother had put in over a long period of time. Matilda had lost her own battle for the throne, but her family would win the war, and it was all thanks to Matilda's endeavours.